Hello, this is Dr. Carney, and this is a brief introduction to analyzing fiction, and it may be a review for lots of people. So first, what is analysis? Analysis is effectively taking something apart and examining its constituent elements. So I have this photograph by Russell McCutcheon of a camera that's been completely disassembled. And somebody who's doing analysis will first, as they disassemble this object, and then they analyze its constituent parts. And that's what we're going to be doing when we analyze fiction. Is we have to take it down to its constituent parts and analyze those constituent parts and see how they're working together. So what are the constituent elements of fiction? This is a diagram I made of the what I think are these terms are somewhat reductive, but they work. Plot, at the very top of the star, character, setting, language, and narration. I think I might be covering up one of these bottom ones with my picture, but plot, character, setting, narration, point of view, language, and language means all sorts of things. Diction is word choice. Authors are going to make decisions to use certain words over others. Figurative language is similes, metaphors, those sorts of things. Allegory is a form of figurative language, an extended metaphor. Symbolism, when a word evokes a certain cultural association or image, like a dove is a traditionally associated with peace. And then I guess this would be the sixth element of fiction is theme, but I don't think it's a separate element. I think theme it's not a separate part, but something akin to the ideas that emerge as a result of the interactions of the elements of fiction. So all of these elements of fiction, plot, character, setting, narration, point of view, and language, they kind of work together to produce the theme or the message or the meaning of a work of fiction. So I want to work our way through each part just one by one. So the first part of fiction is plot. This answers the question of what happens in the story. So there's a really useful diagram. It was created by a person named Freytag. I'm blanking on his name. I think his first name was Gustav Freytag. He was a dramatist, and he worked in the early 20th century he was helping people write drama, not necessarily a scholar. But that's neither here nor there. But this is his pyramid, Freytag's pyramid. And he says most plots are structured in this way. They begin with exposition. Exposition establishes the general situation, the characters, and it begins to hint towards some sort of inciting incident. Inciting incident introduces conflict, right? Something is happening where the character or characters is, they're threatened, they have a desire, something happens to animate them towards action. So then there's rising action towards the resolution of the conflict that has been introduced, and this is where we have a lot of the events of the story take place. But eventually, this conflict comes to a head. It has to be. We use the term resolved, and if it's resolved, and then at the very end of the story, there's this falling action, sometimes called a denouement, where the loose ends are tied together. I prefer the term falling action, and the resolution is happily ever after. Or if you watch 1980s Brat Pack movies, it's this when they show all the characters in a montage and they tell you where they ended afterwards. So some interesting things to highlight. There are different types of conflict that are worth remembering. An internal conflict is when it's not out in the world. It's a psychological conflict, right? Needing to get over cowardice, trying to reconcile conflicting desires, struggling with an like if it's a novel of ideas, struggling with existential questions. An external conflict is things like a monster, if it's a fantasy, a wizard, a sorcerer, a dragon, right? An actual creature that you need to fight against. This issue of reversal is useful. It refers to sometimes climaxes can be extended. So you think the resolution has happened, it's starting to go towards the falling action, but then there's a reversal, and the climax is you realize it was just kind of a feint. There's more to the story, right? And we think everything's okay, but then the threats continue. So these are just some useful terms to kind of draw out. Another element of fiction is character. This is a painting from Thomas Stothard. This is Shakespearean characters. It's if you look closely, you could identify all these various Shakespearean characters. It's just a useful image for this slide. There are different types of characters. You're probably familiar with this. The protagonist, that refers to characters who are driven towards the conflict. Not necessarily hero or villain or anything like that. It's not a moral judgment. It just means it's a functional label. Characters that are going towards conflict. Antagonist, not necessarily a villain. It's just they represent the the conflict that the protagonist is approaching. We do get into character value judgments when we have these terms hero and villain. A hero is very specific, manifests the values of a particular society, and is often an aspirational figure. So and this means that the hero's values will change from culture to culture. So the hero of ancient Greece is going to be different than the hero of Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon hero, right? The values are different. Eventually, we get Christian heroes who are very different than ancient world heroes. Villain manifests the inverse values of a particular society. Excuse me. And so they are a kind of warning figure, right? This is how you should not be. Some other useful terms for character analysis. There are dynamic characters and static characters. Dynamic characters change throughout the course of the story. A lot of times we're interested in seeing how they undergo changes. And then static characters are characters who stay the same. Some stories are interesting because characters refuse to change. Think King Lear. A lot of the conflict of that play is because Lear refuses to change when he should be more adaptable. There's also, this comes from a scholar named E.M. Forster, this concept of flat characters versus round characters. E.M. Forster wrote a scholarly account of the novel called Aspects of the Novel, and this is where these terms come from. So flat characters are characters who are psychologically consistent. We kind of know how they're going to act in any particular situation. Round characters are they're much more complex. They're driven by contradictory desires, contradictory feelings. We often don't know how they're going to act in situations, and that's why we find them intriguing. Other than there's the issue of major and minor characters and character functions. So what is the function of a particular character in a story is an interesting question to ask. You have terms like sidekick, love interest, the helper, right? The wise old man, things like that. When we do character analysis, it's sometimes useful to try to identify the function of a character in this story. So moving on to setting, I have the haunting of Hill House here, because it makes a really interesting case about how even with the image of the face and the house connecting, that setting can also be a kind of character. But also a story about a haunted house shows how important setting can be in a story. And then the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow is a place, so once again, setting is a very important aspect of any sort of fiction. But there are different types of setting. The first type I'd like to talk about is the unfocused setting, the abstract setting, or ahistorical. It's where the setting is not that important. It's not that detailed. It's not a particular place in time. The suburbs, right? It's just the general setting. If we're talking about the suburbs in the 1930s, we're talking about the suburbs in the 1960s. Doesn't matter, right? The unfocused abstract setting. It means that the in this story setting is not as important. We have focused, concrete, and historical setting, where setting is very important for establishing historical moment, motivation. A lot of time spent on details in the setting. Think the Lord of the Rings. A lot of secondary world fantasy spends a lot of time on the setting. You open up the novel, and what's the thing on the first page? It's a map. And and then with historical fiction, a lot of times the setting is going to render certain conflicts. So if you think about something written in the antebellum South, slavery, or maybe during the Civil War, or if you're going to write something that takes place during World War II, the conflict will be a background of the set. The conflict will be informed by the setting. Setting is often used by writers to render mood. So I have two examples of scary text here. So setting can cultivate an emotional state for your reader. Sometimes it's important for writers to do that. In horror fiction, they want to get you hospitable to being scared, right? And trying to think of another example. There are particular settings associated with romance, right? So like the romantic landscapes are often part of romance, right? Setting as character, a lot of times setting can become a kind of character. I'm thinking like Hogwarts in the the Harry Potter books. Hogwarts itself is it manifests certain personality, right? It's quirky, it's unexpected, it's very dynamic, right? You never know, you might get turned around. It keeps secrets. And then setting and plot. I already talked about how setting can furnish certain conflicts. There's so much more that we can talk about setting, but I want to move on to narration and point of view. So all stories, even when they're written as novels, even if they're written as short stories, have narrators, right? There is a source of language that's rendering the story. And sometimes the narrator is a character. Sometimes the narrator is completely outside of the virtual world that's being created through the story. There are different points of view. I mentioned some can be a character, some can not be a character. So first-person narration, they use the pronoun I. They're often going to be in the story. They're telling their story. Second-person narration, which is really strange, it's written in an imperative form. You do this, you do that. You walk into the room, you go to that place, blah, blah, blah. Very experimental. It's highly rare, right? Second-person narration, it's going to be a writer who's really wanting to take some chances. Third-person narration is often the most common. It's a description of what's happening to other people. There are all these events, and the narrator is outside and above. Sometimes there's still a character in the story, but they might be distant. They might be relating something that was told to them. Right? But third person means there is this distance. So narrators have different levels of knowledge about what's going on, different levels of access to the psychology of their characters. You have an omniscient narrator who's godlike. The Victorians really liked this. The omniscient narrator knows everything about everyone. All their intentions will actually give you access to their thoughts. The limited narrator is the narrator who might have access to a single character, but other characters are opaque and inaccessible. There's a term from narratology, the study of narrative, called focalization, where perhaps a narrator, for the most part, doesn't seem that they have omniscient access to a certain character's psyche, but they will focus so intensely on a single character that they artfully allow you access through intense descriptions of their experiences. It's a complicated idea, but focalization is useful for when you're maybe not given an omniscient access to a narrator's mind, but you still get a sense of what's going on in their mind. And then an objective narrator, it's kind of a rare, just like second-person narration is more experimental and rare, I think it's fair to say objective narrator is more experimental and rare. This is a narrator who just neutrally describes what's happening. Ernest Hemingway kind of is the avatar of this approach. He just says what's happening and tries not to provide any commentary. Of course, there's going to be commentary there just because a narrator is choosing what to include and what to not to narrate, right? So there's always going to be commentary. But the objective is no access to anyone's mind. You're almost like a photojournalist. You're just putting the camera on the people and watching them do their thing. Narration happens in certain tenses. Past tense narration. When we tell stories, we're often conventionally telling about what has already happened. So we'll tell stories in the past tense. He walked into the room is in past tense, but it's important to remember that the auditor or the reader experiences that as if it's happening before their eyes. So even though it's in the past tense, we don't experiencing as if it's already happened. We're still experiencing it as a present experience. Present tense narration. He walks into the room. He pours himself a cup of coffee. He starts giving his lecture. It's once again, it's experimental. Not a lot of people use present tense. It tends to create in your reader a sense of the mystical or the strange. Future tense. he would walk into the room. He would pour himself a cup of he would soon pour himself a cup of coffee. It's kind of artful. People use it, but for the most part, if you want to talk about conventional narration, people tend to lean on the past tense. But these present tense and future tense forms of narration are out there. They just tend to be more artsy novels, fiction. Language. I put this image of the matrix code up here because I think language is what stories are made out of. Stories create virtual worlds, and what constitutes the virtual world. The virtual world is constituted by language. By analogy, the code of the virtual world created by a story is the language. So language is very important. I don't think it's maybe it's not an exaggeration to say it's the most important element of fiction. But I want to start with this distinction between denotation and connotation. Literary artists really focus on this distinction. Denotation is what words mean in a direct way, no prevarication. We all know that an apple is a fruit, is red, it's round, apple, right? Connotation, though, is what an apple might suggest, right? The fall, knowledge, sin, right? All of these sorts of things, right? Connotation is, I think it's appropriate that I'm struggling because it's how writers try to express the inexpressible. It's funny that writers are interested in the inexpressible, but they're using expression to express the inexpressible, and that's what content. That's a very important distinction anytime you're talking about language and literary art. Diction refers to the word choices that a writer makes. Every single word that is in a story was decided on by a writer. So I think it's important, like when people are described by certain analogies or by certain metaphors, or settings are described by certain analogies or metaphors. This was a decision by the literary artist. Why did they do this? That's an interesting question to ask. Figurative language is a really broad category. There's all sorts of forms of figurative language. Figurative language, I think you could think about it as how writers would use ornamental language when they deviate from standard discourse and start trying to, decorate their prose with, certain rhetorical tactics, argumentative tactics, metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, personification, apostrophe. You can look up all of these. There's apostrophe, for example, is when a writer expresses something, addresses the intangible, right? The cosmos. Woe is me. That's a kind of an apostrophe. Or you're addressing an inanimate object as if it's animate. Oh, Grecian urn. That's an example from a poem, but that sort of stuff happens in fiction as well. But there are all sorts of forms of figurative language. Symbolism is often symbols are figurations, but symbols are when a writer has an image and they connect meaning to it. So a skull, death. Think about a story a lot of people have read is the Cask of Amontillado, and it's a story about vengeance. And spoiler alert, this character Montresor takes his enemy to his doom. In the story, his enemy is dressed up like a fool. It's carnival. So in that sense, what does this costuming symbolize? Perhaps it symbolizes that the protagonist, Montresor's enemy, his name is Fortunato, is a fool, right? There's more. So I think this is pretty obvious what symbols are, but there are but there is an important distinction that we should make. Traditional symbols are symbols with a clear-cut connection, right? So the dove, peace; apple, knowledge; skull, death. You can be a little flippant here. Red octagon is stop. Right? We know how to decode those. Those are traditional symbols. But writers don't always use traditional symbols. They will sometimes create a private language that is maybe only cohering within a particular work. And it's sometimes our job to discover that. So I'm trying to think of a really good private symbol in literature. Let me see here. If I could, one might come to me. Private symbol. Raymond Carver, I don't think he's the only one who does this, but Raymond Carver is a fiction writer, and he writes about the suburbs, and the suburbs for him, I think, symbolizes a place of loneliness and spiritual desolation, right? Maybe not everyone is writing about the suburbs in this way, but that's what I mean, kind of like where symbols aren't always traditional symbols. Writers can kind of encode a meaning into something and take it up as a symbol within their work. And then imagery is just a lot of writers, they're not just telling you stories, they're giving you beautiful pictures. They're painting images with words, a description. And some writers are very imagistic. So that's all the elements of fiction, and they all work together to produce theme. And theme is very intangible to talk about. Theme is, we can use a broad stroke and say the theme is the message of the story, or the meaning, or the significance, or it's the insight, the wisdom, whatever it is. Writers have things that they want to communicate to readers, to auditors, and they pull on the technology of narrative to do it. Narrative is not very good for like a direct message. Sometimes it does give a direct message in the case of like political allegory, literary journalism, but a lot of times it's not very direct. If you're going to use fiction to send a message, you have to realize that it's sending a certain message in a certain way, and it's meant to be, for example, if you really want to send a direct message, the genre of the op-ed piece in the newspaper is very useful, right? Why write a 500-page novel about the horror of war when you could just write an op-ed piece for the newspaper about the horror of war? You look at and actually use statistics in that journalistic piece. So fiction has certain benefits, but it sends its messages in certain ways. It's its themes in certain ways. But where do these themes come from? Where do these messages, these meanings come from? They come from the elements of fiction. I like the analogy of flavor. I have a witch's brew here. When we have a taste of a dish and we're like, wow, that was really delicious, and we try to describe what it tastes like, it's actually where do these flavors come from? They come from all the ingredients, the preparation methods, the spices and stuff. And you can think about all of those elements contributing to a flavor. Plot, character setting, narration, language, they're all like the ingredients, the spices, the preparation methods, and they contribute to the theme of a story. So theme, when you discuss theme, a savvy literary critic is always going to connect any sort of thematic analysis to formal descriptions, right? Any theme is going to be connected to analysis of character, or analysis of plot, or analysis of setting, or language and narration point of view. So thank you very much. That was a brief introduction to analyzing fiction, and I hope it was useful. Have a good day.